Hi guys, Miss Sandell here. I hope you're having a really great week. Well, we're about to start our last discussion on the final movement in American literature, so go ahead and get that handout available so we can get started on that. I do want to say it's been a great semester. I've enjoyed having all of you in class and reading your responses and your remarks, and it's just been a joy. So I hope you have enjoyed this class, and I hope it inspires you to keep reading, because that's what it's all about after all, right? All right, so we're going to talk about postmodernism, and as you'll notice, it gives us 1965 to the present as the date. What you need to know about that date is it's kind of, some people say 1970, some people say 1965, but it's somewhere in that area. And certainly if you have any kind of background in history, you can remember what kind of time period this was, how volatile in America politics was, social issues were at that time. So I want you to keep that in mind as we go forward. And there's not much here in the notes, but really I want you to think about this movement and how you can see these things perhaps in people that you know, in society today as a whole, or how it applies to us. You know how this goes. I'm always interested not only in what happened and what was done and what these movements represent, but how we can see these things in culture today, in our world today. All right. So the first thing that it says is that this term, postmodernism, has been applied to much of contemporary writing, particularly with reference to the use of experimental forms from the 1960s to the present in literature. And what they're trying to say there is that a lot of writing, it doesn't necessarily all look the same, but this idea of experimentation is common to much of postmodern literature, and we'll talk a little bit about that in a moment. One of the things they say here is that there's a tendency toward historical discontinuity, alienation, asocial individualism, solipsism, where the self can know nothing but its own modifications, and that the self is the only existent thing, and existentialism, often in its heightened sense. So you really see the emphasis and the influence that existentialism has on modern day society. It doesn't end. Remember, we drag everything that came before us into the way we see things today. Anyway, so another thing I want to point out before we go on is I really see this with people is the alienation and asocial behavior. You know, a lot of people feel isolated. A lot of people feel that they are alienated from the process, from the American dream, from, you know, a lot of different things. And I want you to think about that. Do you feel alienated from certain institutions or organizations, and why or why not? The other thing I want to talk about is, what does asocial mean? Asocial individualism. I see this all the time. These are people who do not have to operate in social groups. They operate individually. They prefer working individually to working with other people. Now, here's the thing. As human beings, if you've taken psychology, sociology, you know that we naturally gravitate toward groups. So it's something interesting when we're pulling away, and as a movement, you see many people moving away from the social aspect of society. And so here's what I want to say to you, and I'm sure you've discussed this in psych or soc, but it has very detrimental effects when you have a culture of people who are unwilling or unable to work with one another or to interact in a social setting. You know, one thing that has happened since I've been here at the college, and I finished 19 years at Carl Albert this July. And one thing I've seen a difference in just the 2 decades that I've been here, is that I've had people say to me, you know, I'd rather take online classes so I don't have to talk to anybody in class. So those of you who are listening, you're all taking an online class. And I know this isn't true of everybody online, but I found that very disconcerting. Like when someone said, I just don't want to take a class because I don't want to listen to other people. I don't want to have to interact with other people. FYI, that's all part of this modern movement, this postmodern movement, where people feel somehow uncomfortable listening to other people's opinions, or which by the way is what we do in education, but just feeling uncomfortable, feeling like they don't want to hear the input of other people. It's very asocial. Like, I'm okay with what I believe, or with whatever I get out of it, I get out of it. I don't want to hear what anybody else gets out of it. But the problem with that is that when you discuss literature, it's such an enhancing experience to listen to what other people are saying, their input, their perspectives, their frame of reference. And so it's part of what makes it so enjoyable. So where do you stand on that? Do you see yourself reflected in this postmodern movement? Do you see people you know reflected in this movement? I certainly see it and hear it frequently in all the circles that I run in. All right, so let's move on after that. A kind of spiritual malaise, a vague sense of mental or moral ill-being. I find this to be true as well, enveloping many people. So when you're talking about this malaise, it's talking about, I've talked to people who say to me, I don't know exactly what's wrong, but I feel like something's off. And this is not just, having a bad Monday or manic Monday or terrible Tuesday. I mean, this is the way it is. Like, many people, it says enveloping, which is also a very interesting way of describing this. It's not just having a bad day or a bad month or even a bad year, but this is how they describe themselves spiritually, is that there's something wrong. There's a more mental or moral ill-being. Like, it doesn't rest easy. Okay, here's the next part. There's a denial of order, presentation of a highly fragmented universe in the created world of art, an emphasis on critical theories, phenomenology, the study of the development of human consciousness and self-awareness. So I see that, don't you? I mean, even in TV shows about self-awareness, figuring out what's wrong, figuring out, what's the culprit here, what's the source of my issue or my problem. And one thing I want to say about here is I really see a denial of order all the time. I mean, people don't respect people who are in authority. I mean, you see that. You see that a lot. They don't respect their parents. They don't respect teachers. They don't respect, policemen. They don't respect, and I'm not talking about, having issues with people who are doing the wrong thing, but I'm talking about people who are, as a whole, unhappy and discontent and unable to fall under the authority of someone else. And you see this all the time. Even if you're at Walmart, you see this and hear about it. Okay, the next thing it says is there's a denial of traditional form in novels. So they start experimenting with novels, and even they come up with something called the anti-novel, which experiments with fragmentation and dislocation on the assumption that the reader will be able to reconstruct reality from a disordered and unevaluated pieces of direct experience. Okay, so one of the things I want to talk to you about in anti-novel is I read one at the University of Tulsa when I got my second master's degree there in English literature, and I took a class in postmodernism. And the subject matter on the novels, very different, exactly what they're saying here. But one novel that I particularly remember and recall was a story. It was the basic story of Cinderella. And in every chapter, something different happens to Cinderella, but it's never what the story, what the storybooks say. So, like, for instance, in Chapter 1, Cinderella goes to school and becomes successful. In Chapter 2, she's raped. Chapter 3, she's murdered. In Chapter 4, it's replaying her life in every single chapter. So, like, you read the same story, you read the life of Cinderella, but you read all of the alternate versions of what might have really happened to her in real life. I mean, it was really kind of, different, but the emphasis being on, nothing's fairy tale. Life isn't a fairy tale, and here's how it works out for real life Cinderellas everywhere. Kind of interesting idea, though, don't you think? Anyway, so let's read that last note. The typical protagonist has become not a hero, but an anti-hero, a character who has the converse of most of the traditional attributes of the hero. This hero is graceless, inept, sometimes stupid, and sometimes dishonest. And I always say this, and I know this is one of those series that has stopped producing TV shows, but if you've ever watched The Office at all, Michael, the lead character, the manager who's supposed to be the one in charge, is absolutely everything. He's graceless, inept, stupid, dishonest. He's all of those things. He's technically an anti-hero because he's also the main character of that show and the one that everybody's rooting for, despite the fact that he's incompetent in every possible way. And he has this position and he's totally incompetent. Anyway, so that's something to think about in your discussion board responses here. I really would like some input on, as usual, what you thought of this particular movement and whether or not you see this movement to be something around you, like in the world. I think it should be easier for us to identify this, and how do you relate with it? I'm looking forward to reading your responses, and again, it's been great having you all in class. All right, have a good one. Bye-bye.